Good morning, Facebook. Hey, it's been a while since I've been able to enjoy a cup of coffee with you. So I wanted to make a video today because yesterday I posted up a little graphic about the salt rising bread. Now, as you know, we've been selling salt rising bread all along, but I wanted to explain what the graphic was all about for those of you that don't know. So shortly after I returned home from the Navy in 2005, the company that made what was called a salt rising yeast, Plantation's Pride was the name of the company. I believe, if I remember right, it was either that or Puritan's Pride. But either way, the company went out of business and stopped producing the salt rising yeast. So I wanted to explain a little bit what's going on with the salt rising and why this is such a big deal for me. So salt rising yeast is not yeast, okay? They called it yeast because it was what bakers could recognize as the way to get your bread to rise. So in the Appalachian Mountains and along those regions a long time ago, they couldn't get commercial yeast for bread making. So what they did was they found out that if they took cornmeal and mixed it with warm milk and kept it hot for so long, the cornmeal would eventually start to bubble and create this bacteria. The bacteria is the secret to salt rising bread. However, the bacteria has to be raised in an environment that's alkaline, so that way no yeast interferes with it. So they weren't doing the traditional sourdough thing where they were creating yeast out of flour and water. What they were doing was they were creating this bacteria that became the leavening agent for the bread. So in order to do that, you have to keep it at a stable temperature for so long, and you have to be able to have this starter set and ferment and kind of harvest this bacteria growth. The second stage, you have to set it as a sponge. So you take what you've harvested over the 14 hours or so of letting that initial starter, that cornmeal starter go, you take that, you mix it with some flour and water, now you're feeding the bacteria the sugars from the flour. So once you start feeding the bacteria, it becomes very active, and then that's where you get this sponge that rises up and gives you your leavening for the bread. And then that sponge goes into your bread, and then you make your bread out of that. And so what you end up with is this denser type of loaf of bread, and it has this aroma that, if you're a salt rising fan, you know what the aroma and the taste is all about. But it has this really kind of like a cheesy type of aroma that comes with the bread, and it's a very unique bread. A lot of people have grown up with it. So back to the story about Plantation's Pride. When they stopped making the yeast, a lot of bakeries were unknown on how to make that starter. You could take just cornmeal and milk and put it together, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So there's a certain way that you have to mix some certain ingredients in with your cornmeal, so that way it allows for that bacteria to grow and become strong and healthy without dying off too quickly or just being too weak. So that was the key, or the trick, to making the salt rising bread. So we tried it when we were not able to get the yeast for a while. We tried it. We tried doing the cornmeal mash. It never came out. We could never harvest a really good bacteria growth, and so we just kind of gave up on it. And then shortly after, we found out that Ecklof Bakery out in Olean was the one that was making salt rising bread, and they were distributing it down here. So they started delivering bread to the Jamestown area, and we started purchasing that bread and selling it out of the front of the store. It's not the same though. It doesn't have the flavor, it doesn't have the aroma, it doesn't taste the same, it doesn't have the same texture profile. None of that is the same as the salt rising that we used to make, and a lot of people liked our salt rising bread. So for the last several years, we've been making or buying in and selling the salt rising bread, and you've probably seen it in the store. It's had a couple of different labels on it, but it's the same bread. It comes from the same bakery, and it's being distributed now through Maplevale Farms, which is where almost everybody in the area is getting the salt rising bread. There are a couple other places that are making salt rising in the area, and again, it's not the same. Okay, it doesn't have that same aroma when you toast it. It doesn't taste the same. And again, if you know salt rising bread, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So this year I decided that this was the year I was going to try to figure out salt rising bread. So for about a month now, I've been doing some research, trying to find information online. It's difficult to find a lot of information online, but I did come across a couple of ladies who did a salt rising bread project down in West Virginia, and I started to follow what they were doing and read up on the work that they were doing. They've been doing this since the early 90s, trying to reinvigorate the tradition of salt rising bread. So I reached out and got a hold of one of the ladies that was part of this project, and she had put out a book several years ago. So I asked her if I could get a copy of the book, and she sent me a copy of the book, and she sent me some great information on salt rising bread. So I was able to actually read up on the science that they had discovered about how salt rising works. And so we started the last couple of weeks experimenting, and we've put together a cornmeal mash that produces the exact same scent and aroma and taste as the way I remember my dad's salt rising bread was. And so the only problem is getting that bread to look like a loaf of bread instead of a dense little brick, because you run the risk, if you get too much of a loaf of bread, then you lose the flavor because you're doing more bread and less salt rising. So it's there's a balancing act that we had to find and all agree on that this is what we wanted to have the salt rising bread be like. And I think we finally found it. We're still playing around with trying to get it just a little bit more volume, but it's the same loaf of bread, and we don't want to risk putting the taste of that bread and the aroma of that bread at cost just to get volume in the loaf of bread. So we've kind of settled on a bread that I believe has the exact same texture, has the exact same flavor, and the exact same aroma as the traditional salt rising bread that we've been making at the bakery here since I was a little kid, since back in 1956, before me. So I think we finally found it, and that's exciting because it was a lot of work. We've done a lot of trial and error and experimentation, and if any of you have ever heard about salt rising or made salt rising bread, you'll find out that when you make the bread, it creates quite an awful stink. That bacteria stinks like crazy, and it fills the whole bakery up with that terrible smell. But the end result in the bread is a delicious loaf of bread. And again, you've probably had it at breakfast when you've gone out to breakfast anywhere in this area. You can almost go to breakfast at every restaurant and they offer a salt rising bread. But if you've had it in the last 12 to 15 years, it's not the same. It's not the same as you remember it. And that's because all of the bakeries in the area lost that yeast and kind of gave up on trying to figure it out. So I wanted to announce to everybody that we're actually selling the loaves of bread now in the store that we're making. It's a traditional old-fashioned loaf of salt rising bread. It's got all the smell, it's got all the flavor. You'll know it the minute you open up the bag. You'll be like, that is the bread that his dad used to make. And that's the biggest complaint that I've gotten from people over the last few years with us bringing in that other bread, is that people will buy the bread and then they come in and complain that I need to learn how to make the bread the way my dad made it. This bread doesn't taste the way your dad made it. Your dad made a much better salt rising bread than you. Well, I made that salt rising bread also for a few years when I came back from the Navy, but unfortunately we stopped getting that yeast, and it kind of put us at a standstill with it. So this year though, I changed that. So I now have traditional old-fashioned salt rising bread in the store. And for those of you that love salt rising, I invite you to stop in and put it to the test, okay? Buy a loaf of salt rising bread. Again, it's not going to be a big giant loaf like your white bread looks. It's going to be that traditional, think of a rustic bread. And I'm telling you, when you take it home and toast it, the minute you open that bag, you're going to know Chad figured it out. We finally got salt rising the way it's supposed to be. And once I'm done with the current inventory that I have of the salt rising we've been buying in, I'm not buying in that salt rising anymore. We're going to be making it full time. So I'm making it now. You can order it to be shipped. So those of you that live out of town who are wishing they could get a good loaf of salt rising bread, please call. I will ship it to you. So that way we can share the love of salt rising with everybody who remembers that taste and flavor. So once again, I'm doing it the way my dad did it, okay? but I just had to figure out how to get that first part of the batch done. And now I think we're on to something good. So all of you who love Salt Rising, I want to thank you for continuing to stop in the store and give me the feedback that you've given me that's given me the drive to figure this out. And we finally got it, and I've never celebrated over something so stinky in all my life, but I'm celebrating this Salt Rising bread. So hopefully you guys have a good morning, and I'll see you soon when you stop in the bakery. Until then, I got to get back to work because I know they've come out a couple of times looking for me. Have a wonderful day.